This is another History Revision podcast, and this one is on the effects of World War I on Russia. The initial reaction. There was an initial outpouring of popular enthusiasm and patriotic sentiment for the war. Nicholas became the symbol of the nation's resistance in its hour of need. The Duma voted war credits, which were the raising of taxes and loans needed for the war, and all but the 5 Bolshevik deputies in the Duma pledged themselves to the national struggle. Russian soldiers carried icons of the Tsar as they marched to the front, and St. Petersburg changed its name to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too German. But by the end of 1914, the defeats, for example at Tannenberg, had dampened enthusiasm, and people realised it would not be a quick victory, and there were reports of incompetence in the army flooding back into Russia. For example, a lack of weapons, rifles, and shells. So what was the political impact? The Tsarist government had set up military zones where the army assumed command in a sort of martial law. This was opposed by the liberal Zemstva, who believed that civilians had a role in the war, not just the army. The decision to ban the sale of alcohol, especially vodka, at the sale of 1914 was resented by the people and evaded, as the peasants distilled their own, and the government ended up just losing loads in tax. The Zemstva did establish the Union of Zemstva to provide medical facilities which the government seemed to neglect. Business and factory owners set up the Congress of Representatives of Industry and Business, which actually included some Duma members as well, and that was to coordinate production for the war. In June 1915, the Zemstva and municipal Dumas joined to form the All-Russian Union of Zemstva and Cities, or Zemgor, led by Prince Lvov. It wanted to help the government in the war effort, but was never allowed any influence by the Tsar. Soon it became a focus for liberal dissent, and Nicholas just blamed it for causing too much trouble. In August 1915, the cadets, Octobrists and progressives formed the Progressive Bloc, which accounted for 236 of the 422 deputies, and even the SRs who weren't in it voted with it on every occasion, even though they weren't part of it formally. And they demanded a government of public confidence with new ministers, pretty much a constitutional monarchy. In September, Nicholas suspended the sittings of the Duma, and from then on they had to meet in secret. They believed that they were trying to prevent a revolution, but when the Tsar ignored their calls for compromise, they began to directly challenge the Tsar's authority, and it became a source of political resistance. And all these organisations were trying to help run the war, and Nicholas resented any implication that it would lessen his autocracy. The role of the Tsar. The view that the strong leadership was lacking became more prevalent. People were increasingly criticising the Tsar. He was no longer their little father. In the same month as the Progressive Bloc was formed, Nicholas responded to further defeats by placing himself in total charge of the army, becoming Commander-in-Chief. The intention was to rally the country round himself as the little father, and it was brave but ultimately stupid, as now all defeats were personally his fault, and he lost the confidence of the generals, and he had already lost confidence of generals, and he had insufficient military experience to succeed. Plus, it took him away from Petrograd, where things obviously were going to happen. He seemed unconcerned about the events in Petrograd, though, and his letters to his wife showed more interest in his kids' measles and the unrest on the streets. He left Rasputin and Alexandra in charge, theoretically. After the Tsar went to the front, they became effectively the government. Rasputin did reorganise army medical supplies, but that's about the only positive thing you can say about him. In Petrograd, Rasputin was meddling in appointments and alienated people from the Tsar even further. And it didn't help that his wife, who was left in charge as well, was German. She wasn't a spy, but people assumed she was. So many changes of ministers were made by the Tsar, but ultimately it was with the influence of Rasputin and Alexandra. And the ministers changed so much it hampered the war effort, and people blamed Rasputin even if it wasn't totally his fault. Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, warned the Tsar about how unpopular Rasputin was, but to no avail. Rasputin eventually was murdered, but by that point it was too late. The military problems. Russia had mobilised 15 million men, which were on the whole peasants, but it couldn't provide for them, and it got worse rather than got better. The infantry had only 2 rifles for every 3 soldiers, and the artillery, at one point, only had 2 or 3 shells per day, per gun. This was not due to underspending, really, but due to poor administration and a lack of liaison between the government departments. Eventually, the organisation with rifles and shells did get better, but by that time all the good generals had been killed, so they'd lost ground on that front. Despite some victories, the war was going very badly, and by 1916 the army had pretty much come to a halt. Food supplies to them had dried up, and many men were deserting and walking back home. The economic and social costs of the war. The war cost 14 billion rubles by 1918. 15 million conscripts had left industry and agriculture, and that had caused them to slump at a time when they needed to be producing more. Germans took over factories in Poland, which made things worse, and the ports were blockaded so that food couldn't come in from that way and other goods couldn't come in from that way. Peasants' conscription relieved population pressure on the good side, and peasants could actually make money selling grain or horses to the army. But the prices that they were offered were often way too low, and inflation went up, so prices for goods rose that they needed to buy, and so they just ended up keeping the grain, making the shortage in the cities even worse. The requisition of horses and manure for the army made it difficult to sustain food output and produce as much, but it was done until 1916 when the yield eventually began to fall. The main problem was that the army had first priority on using food, and it had the priority of the transport system, the trains. Inflation had been stabilised by the gold standard before the war, but the high spending in the war, which is not alleviated by loans and high taxation, and the abandonment of the gold standard caused massive inflation, 400% inflation. Money was practically worthless, as more and more was pumped into circulation by the government to pay the workers. The main reasons for food shortages, though, was inefficient organisation of transporting grain and fuel by train. As the army was using the trains, and signals broke down, trains broke down or ran out of fuel, and this caused massive shortages, while some food even rotted away and some got rerouted to the front. The increased population in towns made matters worse, as more workers went from the countryside into the towns because more workers were needed to produce the goods and the munitions for the war, and it just exacerbated the food shortages. Non-military factories closed down, causing unemployment in the cities and towns, and strikes became worse because of worsening conditions, and that in turn crippled industry as well. There was a near famine constantly in the cities during World War I in Russia. There was less than a quarter of the bread that had been available in 1914 by 1917. Let's have a look at the effect of morale on Russia. The Brusilov offensive against Austria actually succeeded and almost brought Austria to its knees, but it was too little, as there were in other areas too many Russians actually being killed. Desertion became rife, but the army wasn't on the verge of collapse in 1917. Mutinies, for example, were also occurring in other armies in World War I. And Russia was actually producing more shells than Germany in 1916, but the result of constant stories of defeat meant that all the other problems became more intense. 3 years of total war were too great a strain for the Russian economy to bear. It was almost too much for all the countries in Europe to bear. And those were the effects of the war on Russia.